is a pleasure. Oh, wow. It is a pleasure to be here with you. For me, it's a return visit. As Greg Remke just mentioned, for 5 years, from 2003 to 2008, I was the president of FEE. And many of the times with our programs, I was lecturing here in this room, and it's wonderful to see such a large group of students again, of various younger and older ages, and some adults as well. My time with you this afternoon is going to be on some aspects and themes that relate to the general topic of U.S.-Russian relations, but I want to sort of explain a lot of this in a certain historical context. And the historical context, if you will, is that this month, November, marks the 21st year since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Now, I know many of you, a little younger than me, probably don't know much about this. But as I'm sure all of you know, during the Second World War, the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union were allies against Nazi Germany and Hitler's regime. And at the end of that war, the Germans had been completely defeated. Not just defeated in the sense that they surrendered, but all of Germany was occupied by these Allied powers. And as a consequence, Germany was divided into occupation zones. There was the Soviet zone of occupation in the eastern part of Germany. And then the British, American, and French zones were in the western part of Germany. But then besides the country as a whole being divided into these military occupation zones by these four victorious nations, the German capital of Berlin was also divided into four occupation zones. The eastern half of the city of Berlin was the Soviet zone, and then the western half, West Berlin, was divided respectively into British, American, and French zones. But the particular situation of this is that Berlin was like this little island of these western zones, surrounded by the general Soviet zone of occupation in eastern Germany. And indeed, the closest British or American occupation territory to Berlin was over 110 miles to the west. Now, this occupation went on throughout the second half of the 1940s and into the 1950s, and in fact did not really formally end in the sense of the Western military powers and Russian forces leaving until virtually the end of the 1980s. Now, there was a great embarrassment for the Soviet Union for a good part of the period after this war was over, because the Soviet Union was, as I hope all of you perhaps know a little bit about, a communist regime. It was a political dictatorship in which there was no right of dissent or political disagreement. Dissenters, opposers of the regime, those who were viewed as politically unreliable, could be arrested, imprisoned, and, to be frank, tortured and even killed. Indeed, from the time of the Russian Revolution of 1917 until the 1980s, it has been estimated by Russian and Western historians who have had a chance to read the formerly secret communist archives in Russia that between 65 and 68 million people were killed by the Soviet regime because they were viewed as enemies of communism. And these were innocent, unarmed men, women, and children. And this is the type of very brutal and dictatorial and absolute controlling government that the Soviets imposed on all of the countries of Eastern Europe: Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, and East Germany, which they made into a separate little puppet communist society. Now, as part of the arrangements among these Allied powers at the end of the Second World War in Germany, in principle, people were supposed to be free to move between the occupation zones. So a German who was living in one occupation zone could either, under certain circumstances permanently, but certainly just to travel, to go from one occupation zone to another. As a result of the brutality, the cruelty, the repression of the Soviets and their puppet East German communist government, many Germans who were living in this part of Germany chose to leave living under communist rule. And indeed, from 1945 until 1960, it is estimated that 4 million Germans who were living in the Soviet Eastern Zone chose to cross the borderline between East Berlin, controlled by the Soviets, and West Berlin, controlled by the British, French, and Americans. Now, this was an embarrassment to the government in Moscow, because on the one hand, it's as if people were rejecting by voting with their feet the communist regime. And second of all, a lot of skilled people were leaving, with professions, training, occupations, doctors, lawyers, engineers, scientists, as well as ordinary workmen. So not only was this a political embarrassment, people are voting with their feet not to live under communism, but they're losing valuable portions of their workforce. So the then head of the Soviet Communist Party in 1960-61, a man named Nikita Khrushchev, decided that they were going to stop this, and in August of 1961, they closed any free movement between East Berlin and West Berlin, and they built a wall. And they built a concrete wall 9 to 12 feet high, totally surrounding these Western zones, these British, French, and American Western zones in Berlin, to seal it off and to prevent any people in Eastern Germany from any more attempting to escape by just crossing the street from one part of the city to the other to live under a freer form of government. In other words, the Soviets were saying that the citizens, the people of East Germany, were now basically viewed as the property of the communist government. They owned you in the sense that you couldn't move. You couldn't choose where you wanted to live. The right of freedom to decide, I don't want to live here. I would prefer to live someplace else because I don't like the government, I don't like the oppression, I'm afraid of being arrested. I want greater economic opportunity, was closed off to them. But that didn't stop people from attempting to cross the wall. And indeed, from the time the wall was constructed, beginning in August of 1961, until it finally came down in November of 1989, approximately 5,000 people were able to make an escape across, over, or under the wall. Some people dug tunnels and escaped under the wall. Others even attempted hot air balloons. Some people who knew some archery would go into some building on the East Berlin side and be at a floor in the building higher than some building on the East Berlin side, on the other side of the wall, and would shoot with their crossbow and a cable across, and then slide down over the wall. Some people tried to hide inside and under automobiles. Unfortunately, even though 5,000 people, through these dangerous and uncertain methods, were able to escape, hundreds did not, and in fact died attempting to cross the wall. One of the most cruel and visual of these is that a young man attempted to just literally run across what was a no man's land on the East Communist side of the wall that had landmines, that was patrolled by German shepherds, to just run across and try to get over the wall. But halfway across this no man's land, this security zone, he was shot. And the East German and the Soviet soldiers would not come to bring him out of the no man's land and take him to a hospital. Instead, he was allowed to very cruelly bleed to death for about 3 hours, with people in towers on the West Berlin side looking over the wall and seeing him pleading, "Help me, help me, help me," and the Soviet and the East German soldiers just looking on and letting him pass away. That was the nature of this idea that the government had the right to totally control you, including the ownership of you, to deny you the right to move. Now, throughout history, it has not been uncommon for people to want to leave where they have been born and they've lived part of their lives to make a better life for themselves. We're, or most, I presume, are Americans here. And I know it sometimes sounds like a corny line or a cliche, but the fact is we are a melting pot of many, many different peoples from many, many different parts of the world. Our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents have come here from every continent. And that's because America, through most of its history, was open to people attempting to escape from political oppression, religious persecution, lack of economic opportunity. Indeed, in the 19th century, the 1800s, and for a little bit of the beginning of the 20th century, most people could enter the United States without a passport, without a visa. And indeed, it is estimated that between 1840 and 1914, the year when the First World War began, that between 1840 and 1914, an estimated 60 million people, 60 million people chose to leave Europe and live someplace else. And as I said, they left because of political oppression, religious persecution, lack of economic opportunity. And out of that 60 million people who left Europe to make a life in a different part of the world, about half of them, about 30 million, came to the United States. They crossed the ocean on ships back then. They bought a ticket, and they would land on Ellis Island. This island at the southern end of Manhattan, at the opening to New York City Harbor. And you would meet some immigration agents, but they would basically be only concerned with asking two questions. Did you have a communicable disease? In other words, did you have a disease or an illness that someone else could catch from you? If you did, they would hold you in quarantine until you had, they would hold you on the island in quarantine until you had gotten over your illness or until it was contagious. In other words, other people could catch it from you. Or they would inquire if someone had some mental defect. That is, some mental problem that would prevent them from being self-supporting in the United States, and so they wouldn't have to be some financial or other burden upon the citizens of the United States. And I should mention that at that time, before 1914, there was no welfare state. There was no government welfare payments, no government health care, no government retirement. The concern was people who might come here and be a financial burden because of some physical or mental disability that would prevent them from being self-supporting, to be a burden on private charity, not government charity. But if one did not have a contagious disease, and if one did not have some mental or serious physical handicap that would prevent the person from being self-supporting, you passed through the immigration line, you boarded a ferry, the ferry took you to the southern end of Manhattan Island, Manhattan that way, and you landed on the dock, you came ashore, and now you were an American. Now, that you had to apply for American citizenship, but you are now free to live and to work. And that is the origin of virtually all of us and our families here in this room. I'm an example of that. My grandparents all came to the United States. I'm a little older than you. All came to the United States as little children, indeed before the First World War, around 1905. My father's family were German, Irish, and English. My mother's family were Lithuanian and Russian Jews. They had come to the United States, my mother's parents, because in the then imperial Russia, before the First World War, there was persecution of various minority groups, including Jews. They would go into Jewish villages, and the soldiers would go in and proceed to burn down people's homes, physically attack them, attempt to destroy their places of worship. In the case of my father's family, there weren't those types of religious or political persecutions, but there was a desire to be in an environment in which there was greater economic opportunity. And even if the parents were not to do so well in their own lifetime, the idea that they would have brought their children to America so their children and then their grandchildren could have the economic opportunity that they would never have had if the parents had stayed in the old country. Now, in fact, there's versions of that story for all of us, or most of us at least, in this room, of our ancestors coming this way. Now, during this communist period in Russia, when Russia was the Soviet Union, this communist political entity, immigration was barred. There were guards on the border. There were violent methods of attempting to stop people with landmines, barbed wire, all type of methods to see that someone could not escape. And indeed, if you attempted to escape, you would be shot, if they could, in the attempt, or you would be captured. Very few people actually could make it across the border. It was very heavily watched and secured and patrolled. And you would then be sent to labor camps in places like Siberia. And in there, people would be often worked to death, often tortured under interrogations. My wife is Russian. Greg Remke mentioned that in the early 1990s, I was traveling in the former Soviet Union as an economic consultant on market reform and privatization. How do you take state industry, state factories, government-owned farms, government-owned apartment buildings, government-owned businesses, and turn them over to private enterprise, put them in private hands? And at that time, I met my wife, who was working in Moscow. Her grandfather spent 10 years in slave labor camps in Siberia much earlier. What was his crime? He had once been a businessman. It was a crime to own a business. It was a crime to make your living by selling products in the market and earning a profit. And for that he was arrested. All of his property was taken, including his wedding ring. And he was kept in slave labor camps for over 10 years and severely beaten and losing his hearing because of some things that were done to him in the interrogations. And that was the reality of life in the Soviet Union. Now, 2 years after the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. Mr. Remke pointed out that during these times when I was traveling in the Soviet Union as a consultant, I, by the circumstances, were in two places where the communist government was attempting to crush opposition. In January of 1991, I was in the then Soviet Republic of Lithuania. Now it is an independent country. And the Soviet government attempted to crack down on the emerging democratic movement that wanted their country to be free in Lithuania. And in one night, they seized the government buildings in the capital of Vilnius. They killed 13 people that night, some of them crushed by tanks, others shot. I was in these crowds of friends of mine during a Soviet attack on the streets, and bullets were whizzing by my head. I saw people fall down around me. But the desire for freedom is very strong. The communists had communist government had grabbed the radio station, the television station. They attempted to control all media and information. But there was one clandestine radio station that had not been captured. And the head of the Lithuanian Democratic Movement went on the radio. And he went on the radio and said to the people of Lithuania that their budding and emerging democracy was being threatened, that the communist government in Moscow was trying to crush it. And he called upon the people of his country to come to the capital of Vilnius and try to defend their democracy. Lithuania is a little country. It only has 3.5 million people. The next morning, 1 million people had come from the rest of Lithuania to the capital of Vilnius. And they surrounded their parliament building. And for 3 days, day and night, men, women, and children stood there facing Soviet soldiers and Soviet tanks, willing to risk their lives, facing guns unarmed, because of the desire for freedom and a democratic form of government. Now, luckily, the Soviet government was not willing to use violent force against such a large groundswell of resistance. 1 million people in the center of the city, standing vigilant around a parliament building day and night. And they backed down. But they weren't willing to give up without a fight. And as Mr. Remke mentioned, a few months later, in August of 1991, there was an attempt by the more extreme elements of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union to prevent any reforms, any changes, any loosening of the power, as was being attempted by the then leader of the Soviet government, a man named Mikhail Gorbachev. They arrested him. They attempted to assassinate another prominent Russian political leader in the democratic movement, who later became a president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. But Yeltsin evaded the attempt to capture and kill him, and he went to the Russian parliament building in Moscow. And he called the people of Moscow to come and defend their democracy, for the people of Russia to be free. And tens of thousands of people in Moscow came to the Russian parliament building and surrounded it. And to be honest, people not much older than some of you. Many of those tens of thousands of citizens of Moscow who came to defend their emerging democracy were in their teens or their very early 20s, not much older than you. And for 3 days, they and my future wife and I, we were there most of the time too, faced down Russian tanks. And tragically, a handful of people died there too, including some young people who cared enough about liberty and freedom and democracy that they were willing to run that risk to help their country to be free of this communist dictatorship that had controlled them and their parents and their grandparents for almost 75 years, since 1917. Now, this hardline coup d'etat attempt failed. And that meant basically the inevitability of the end of communist rule in Russia. And the day after this coup failed, there was a huge rally of now hundreds of thousands of citizens of Moscow, cheerful and exuberant and excited that the communist attempt to maintain their power had failed. And they had this huge rally in a plaza behind the parliament building. And many of the leaders of the Russian democratic movement spoke to the crowd. And then suddenly everybody looked up, and at the top of the parliament building, the communist flag, the red communist flag with its symbol of the hammer and the sickle, came off the flagpole. And the traditional Russian national colors of the flag went up, which are red, white, and blue. And suddenly, from that ocean of hundreds of thousands of citizens of Moscow came a chant. Svoboda, Svoboda, Svoboda. And that is the Russian word for freedom, freedom, freedom. They wanted to be free of their tyranny and the chance to be like us. And they would call us the normal society. Normal in the sense that you don't have to worry about a secret policeman knocking at the door in the middle of the night to take you away and never be seen again. A normal society without censorship and brutality. A normal society without slave labor camps. A normal society where a person can start a business, work in a business, make his own life and career without having to depend upon the government as the monopoly producer, the monopoly employer, the monopoly determiner of every aspect and element of one's life from birth to death, which is how the system worked. The government in the Soviet Union told you where you would work. They told you what city you could live in. They assigned you a government apartment building and you could not legally live anywhere else under penalty of arrest and imprisonment. And those people were now shouting freedom, freedom, freedom. They wanted to be normal, like us. And that sort of gets us to the state now of what is the status of Russian-American relations. What has happened over the 20 years this coming August, and December actually, since the actual demise and fall of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. The disappearance of the Soviet Union on the political map of the world. At first, under the leadership of that Russian Democrat, Boris Yeltsin, the society attempted to open up. The secrets came out, all the secrets of the secret police, all the secret archives of the communist government were more or less opened for historians and scholars and researchers to look through. And it was a shocking and disturbing experience for many people, because now from these opened archives they found out what happened to their parent or their grandparent or their aunt and uncle, someone who had merely vanished years or decades ago earlier. The records now told what had been their fate. They were worked to death. They were tortured to death. They were simply executed. They were no longer someone who had just vanished, with a hole being left in the memories of the families. There was freedom of speech, freedom of the press. There was the attempt, however imperfectly in hindsight, to try to privatize the government-run economy. Factories were privatized. Businesses were privatized. You could start your own little business. Slowly but surely they began to privatize the government farms and put them into the hands of private farmers. Now, it wasn't done well. There were a lot of contradictions, inconsistencies. There was corruption. There was hypocrisy. There were violations of the rules of the game. And the government, to cover its expenses, printed a lot of money and caused a rather severe inflation, which destroyed the real wealth of a lot of people's savings in the society. But after 75 years of that terrible communist regime, it was like opening the window and fresh air coming in and taking a deep breath and feeling freedom. Now, unfortunately, history follows its own course, and it plays sometimes tragic tricks on people as how things develop. And after this man, Boris Yeltsin, had been president for several years, and the problems, the corruption, the inconsistencies, the difficulties began to pile up and cause resentment in people, he finally realized that he was going to have to step down. And he appointed a predecessor. He appointed the man who would follow him. And that man was a man named Vladimir Putin, who then served as the president of Russia for 8 years and is now the country's prime minister. And in that period, a number of things have changed. Putin had himself made his career as an agent of the secret police, the KGB. That was his profession, a secret policeman who would interrogate, who would surveillance, who would spy, who would manipulate and control. And unfortunately, this is the man who became the head of Russia. And for 8 years, what did he do? He turned his back on the directions of democracy. He slowly but surely shut down opposition parties, manipulating the electoral rules so that all the other parties other than his own were marginalized, prevented from campaigning, restricted in their access to television advertising to push their candidates against him and his party's candidates. And he manipulated the economy. He began to use the government agencies and ministries to give special favors, privileges, subsidies, regulations to benefit those businessmen, small, medium, and large, who would support him. And those who did not support him, who believed that Russia should move in a different, freer direction than the now more closed direction that he wanted to implement in Russia, well, they made up phony charges. And they would seize these people's businesses and present false evidence in a court of law and send those people to prison in Siberia, where some now sit. Not only to eliminate those who are potential businessmen who would oppose what Putin wanted, but also to set an example. Everybody else should keep their mouth shut, their head down, and just go along with what the government wants, because that can happen to you too if you pick up your head, you open your mouth, and seem to be opposing what Putin and his regime was attempting to implement and expand. Now this has overlapped, spilled over into foreign policy as well. In those first years after the end of communism in Russia, U.S. and Russian relations were fairly normal, in the sense that the Russians wanted to be a partner in an open, free world arrangement with other countries. There were agreements on the dismantling of missiles. There was agreements in attempts to destroy other forms of tension and suspicion among the countries. Trade opened up. There were a virtually uncontrolled exchange of cultures, scientific research, visits between the countries. People could apply in Russia for immigration to the United States, and depending upon their application and the U.S. rules of immigration, could be accepted. And Americans could more easily travel into what had been a very closed society. Because under most of the time of communist rule in Russia, when it was called the Soviet Union, as I said, very few Americans, very few people from the Western countries were allowed into the Soviet Union. And if you were allowed in, you were followed, you were spied on, you were controlled to see that you couldn't talk to ordinary Russian and Soviet citizens, and that they couldn't talk to you. You would have your luggage gone through, your hotel room examined while you were out to see that you didn't have any forbidden literature that you were trying to pass on to some Soviet citizen to read, which the regime did not want him to have and to see. The current president of FI, Mr. Lawrence Reed, was traveling in some of these communist countries in Eastern Europe before the fall of communism. And he, in fact, would occasionally sneak in the forbidden books, the forbidden magazines, into places like Poland, communist Poland in those years, for example. And, of course, running the risk, because he and others who did this could have easily been arrested and imprisoned by those communist governments in Eastern Europe if they had been caught and the authorities had wanted to do that. But since now Putin has tightened up domestically, no freedom of press, no limited freedom of speech, no political opposition. And by the way, one form of seeing that the press does not report things or have, exposés about things the government doesn't want the people to hear about, the way they shut people up in the new Russia under Putin is that they hire contract assassins and they kill newspaper reporters. Indeed, during the last year, there was an article about this in the Wall Street Journal by a Russian reporter who works for a Russian newspaper in Moscow about a week or 10 days ago, that just in the last year, well over a dozen Russian newspaper reporters, people who sort of dig up the real news, what's going on below the surface, what type of shady deals and corruption and violations of people's freedoms and safety is the government practicing. Well over a dozen have been killed, wherein a contract assassin tracks them down in the hallway of the apartment that they live in, and they're shot. That's how the current regime deals, again, with opposition. And the tensions have arisen, therefore, between the United States and Russia. The Russians want to be a great nation, a great power, to be able to have a voice, not just in the normal sense that every country wants to have its sort of a place on the international stage, their culture, their traditions, their customs respected, to have its participation in the world community. No, Putin has stated very clearly that he wants Russia to be a great power so that it will be feared, and that Russia can attempt to influence and control the surrounding parts of Europe and Asia that broke away when the Soviet Union collapsed. The countries that had been part of the Soviet Union and had gained their freedom in 1991. Perhaps you may remember just a couple of years ago, the little former Soviet Republic of Georgia was in a brief war with Russia. And the Russians crushed them and only stopped after they felt they had taught the Georgians a lesson. They have played tricks and carried out a cyber war on the former Soviet Republic of Estonia, that is along the Baltic Sea, where it is clear that Russian-supported hackers went into the Estonian internet system and basically destroyed all communications of the private sector and government agencies for a period of time to try to teach them a little lesson. And even some Russian nationalists who follow Putin have said that the future Russia, the new restored and great power Russia, should not only regain all of these former republics that broke away when the Soviet Union ended in 1991, but that all territory that at any time once belonged to the Russian Empire of the past should be part of the new Russia again. And that includes, in the minds of some of the more extreme and radical Russian nationalists, Alaska. Because Alaska was Russian. It was bought by the United States government from the Imperial Russian government in 1867. That's how we got Alaska originally. And some Russian extreme nationalists dream of a day when even Alaska will once be Russian territory. Now, one of these ways that the Russians have controlled this is that they have attempted to limit and restrict the free movement of people between the United States and Russia again. You see, to leave Russia, it is not just like if you wanted to visit another country. How do you travel if you want to go to another country? For example, Northwood University, where I teach in Michigan, is sending me to the Asian island country of Sri Lanka off the coast of India next month to give some lectures at a university with which Northwood University has a relationship. Well, what do I need to leave the United States? Well, I have my passport, which is just a formal document that I'm a citizen of the United States. The U.S. government had issued me this passport to confirm what my citizenship is, that I haven't committed a criminal offense and have therefore a right as a free citizen to leave the country, enter the country. It's just a formal document of specifying what country you're a citizen of, the U.S., and that you have a legal right to travel. You're not a criminal who's wanted for something. It's basically what a passport is. Anybody can get a passport. It's a matter of applying for it with the forms, paying, I think, the $35 or $40, sending in a passport photo, and you get your passport in the mail in about 10 days to 2 weeks. Any American can do that. In Russia, you have to apply to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And just like under the old Soviet times, today in the new Russia, under Putin, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs will decide whether they deem you worthy and trustworthy of being issued a foreign passport to leave Russia, or whether they will attempt to lock you in and prevent you from traveling. Why is this wrong? Why is this a problem? Why should this be a concern? Well, first of all, it is limiting the free exchange of ideas, the free exchange of scientific discoveries that come through people coming together for meetings, conferences, visiting each other's countries. You cannot go to Russia today without a visa, not just your passport, but a document issued by the Russian government permitting you to enter their country. And to get this visa, you have to be invited by either an individual or some government organization in the new Russia, which basically means you have to be approved to be an okay person. Now, once you get to Russia, you can't just move around you want, right? Let's suppose you want to take a vacation to England or France and Germany, right? You get your passport, you get your plane ticket, you fly to London, Paris, Berlin. You get off the plane, and you just check into a hotel, and you just go around being a tourist, right? You can do anything you want. Or if you're in business, travel around to meet other businessmen to make business arrangements with, right? In Russia, you can't do that. You have to get your visa, which gives you permission from the Russian government to visit their country because you've been sponsored, been given an invitation by a person or an organization that the Russian government approves of, and then they have to approve what hotel you're going to stay in. And you have to have an approval in your visa from the Russian government what other cities you're going to visit, and for how long, and who you're going to see. So they limit the ability of Americans and other Westerners from visiting Russia and having free movement and interaction and exchanges, cultural, scientific, business with ordinary Russians. And they limit the ability of Russians to travel to the United States for science, culture, visits, business, all as an attempt to control people. Indeed, it is the same concept, the same principle as when the old Soviet government had that Berlin Wall. Lock the people in. Keep them under your control. That they only can see what you want them to see. Experience what you want them to experience. Know only what you want them to know. A return to a form of dictatorship. It's often said that the greatest form of diplomacy in helping to create good relations among countries is when the citizens of those countries can meet each other, come to know each other, interact with each other, have a sense that, the language might be different, the culture and the history might be different, but guess what? That person is just like another human being as yourself. The same hopes, the same dreams, the same feelings. And that helps diminish the sense of stranger or alienation or different. That makes it more difficult to view that other human being as an enemy. But But when the government of a country locks their citizens in, and they're not locked in as rigidly and totally as under the old communist government, but this new Russian government under Putin, they're trying to do it again, and they do restrict it significantly, as I tried to explain. It leaves no relationships between the societies other than a government official from the Russian side who is permitted to interact with an official from the American side. And all human relationships become politically manipulated and controlled relationships. And therefore, freedom and understanding and harmonious relationships among the societies become far more difficult. Would it be a problem if more Russians were allowed to travel outside of their country and visit the United States, do business in the United States, even choose to come and, besides vacationing, maybe even live in the United States? No. Because the fact is, the Russians are an extremely highly educated people as a whole. In spite of the communist regime, there was a highly trained and qualified community of scientists, physicists, chemists, biologists, mathematicians, engineers. And if some of them, wanting to now escape from their new form of some degree of oppressive regime in Russia, wanted to come to the United States to escape from that, at the end of the day, we would benefit from it. Those are people with minds, creative abilities, scientific knowledge, expertise, experience. And their entering and joining a freer America, if they chose to move here, would improve our technologies, our scientific research, our ability to apply science to the world of industry and commerce, that at the end of the day would raise our standards of living. No differently than when your great-great-grandparents or grandparents or parents came to the United States, or mine. We are all the descendants of those who are escaping from the type of oppression that some people in Russia today would want to escape from and perhaps be freer in America. To escape from that and to have a second chance. Indeed, the only way to break these tensions is if we say more in open arms that if people want to leave Russia for political or religious or economic reasons, as was in the case in the past, and they can get out of their country, we would be open to allowing many of them to come here, both as respecting a person's desire to be freer and safer, and to benefit from the skills, knowledge, scientific and professional knowledge, expertise, and training that they can add to and contribute to the American society and economy. And it would be telling the Russian government that they should look at their own policies, their own attitudes towards their own people, that some of their own people would rather leave their own homeland, their own families, their own culture, their own language, their entire life, because they don't want to live under a regime that treats them in an oppressive and cruel and intimidating way. That is the only method that maybe in the long run can bring, once again, a harmonious relationship between Russia and the United States. In principle, there is no reason for tension, animosities, but what is necessary is an environment in which people can have a freedom to choose, and Americans would be open to them. Because many of those Russians are still saying, "Svoboda, svoboda, svoboda." They just want freedom, freedom, freedom. Thank you very much. I think we have a little bit of time for questions, comments.
We have time for questions from the whole group, and then we'll break up, and the LD students can come in the back room for an LD session, and the rest can stay in here and ask Dr. Ebeling some more questions to continue the discussion. But we have some questions time for the whole group now. So.
Yes.
In opening up to Russian citizens who want to move to the United States for freedom, how would we balance national security with this respect for freedom, such as we saw with the case of Russian intelligence agents infiltrating the United States recently this year, and a similar approach we took with Cuba, and Castro opened up mental asylums and prisons and had them all go to the United States. So how would we deal with those sort of issues?
Well, it seems to me that in principle, it need not cause a problem. Someone applies for residency in the United States, a right to live in the United States. Well, you attempt to do a security check as best as you can, both through the normal police as well as U.S. intelligence agencies. Let's recall that the fact is you don't have to be a Russian or a Cuban to be a spy in the United States for another country. There have been native-born Americans who either for political reasons or for money have traded secrets to a foreign power, including the old Soviet Union and the new Russia. And that's a problem of security itself, even with an American citizen. But I think it seems to me is that an open and free society tries to take the benefit of the doubt that this people might have legitimate, reasonable, and acceptable reasons to want to come to the U.S. as a legal resident or citizen, and to just examine them if there's any reason to think that they would be harmful to, let's say, as you're suggesting, the security. But if there is no demonstrated reason, then they should be treated on a fair basis of possible acceptance for residence. And like I said, many Russians have had, by any world standard, very good educations in the sciences, in mathematics, in applied fields like engineering. And, well, often it's pointed out that America seems sometimes to be falling behind in a lot of people with top-notch skills in those areas. Well, if you can't grow them at home, bring a few over and become Americans. Have them become Americans. Yeah?
Not just necessarily with immigration, but how can we, as dealing with American policy towards Russia, how can we get Russia to change their policies, whether it's accepting civil defense or something like that? How can we get
that actually is one of the most difficult problems. There's very little that the United States government can do to try to pressure the Russian government to be more open that either won't result in the Russian political authorities digging in their heels even more, or in fact ending up not hurting the Russian government and its policies, but doing detrimental things to the Russian people themselves. The U.S. could say, well, until you start loosening up, we're not going to allow Russians to visit the United States. Well, that doesn't affect Putin. He doesn't care if he comes to the United States at all. When you run all of Russia and can have anything you want brought to you in the Kremlin, what do you care if you visit Disneyland? But right, your whole country is your personal Disneyland because you can get anything you want. But that ends up harming the average Russian who would have wanted to come over here for a scientific conference or maybe some business opportunity or to get an education, for instance. So that sort of ends up backfiring. All we can try to do is to follow the principles that we consider more reasonable or principled or consistent with our concepts of freedom and openness, and let Russians know this and want to emulate us. Let me give you one example of this. I personally think that it has been counterproductive for the now last almost 60 years to have made it difficult for Americans, that is difficult because of U.S. government restrictions, to make it difficult for Americans to travel to communist Cuba. I think that it would have helped over all these decades to one little degree, one major degree, in different ways, to help undermine the communist government under Castro if Americans had had a freedom to move there. You cannot travel to Cuba for any reason without permission from the United States State Department. And if you attempt to travel to Cuba as a U.S. citizen without U.S. State Department permission, if they catch you, they will confiscate your passport, which then restricts you from traveling anywhere else out of the United States. Now, why? I think that if Americans had been allowed to travel there more freely and had a chance to interact with the average Cuban, so Americans were telling them, well, how do Americans live? How do Cubans in South Florida live outside of a communist regime? What economic opportunities? Look, I show up and I have a computer or I have a cell phone. Before these only now began to be allowed among some Cubans today. Only in the last year and a half have Cubans been allowed, in a limited sense, to have a cell phone. How long have we had cell phones? Only in the last year or so are a limited number of ordinary Cubans allowed to have computers with limited internet access. How long have we had computers and internet? Imagine if Americans had shown up with this, and Russia and Cubans are saying, well, look what Americans have. Look what opportunity they have. See their standard of living. They can freely travel here, and they can spend money on vacationing in Cuba. Allowing Cubans to have talked, meet with, see Americans would have helped to open the society by making Cubans even more aware that there was an alternative than the one their own government imposed upon them. So I think that the analogy would be that, therefore, the American government should try to keep its opportunities for Americans to travel to Russia as open as possible, and again, minus security issues, on a reasonable, ordinary, legal basis. Any Russian who wants to visit the United States for, conference, business, a vacation, it's obviously not going to be a terrorist. Let him come, because then he too goes back and is reminded that the world can be different than not only the old one he lived under communism, but the now return to sort of this authoritarian regime that Putin has been attempting to implement. I think that example and openness is the best long-run teacher. Because if we try to sort of bully them or impose sanctions, it's unlikely to work, and it will end up often being counterproductive. There's no easy short-run answer.
Do you currently restrict Russians' ability to immigrate to the United States or to visit the United States?
To the best of my knowledge, other than security matters, no. But the security issues are drawn very broadly. For example, I was president of FEE for 5 years. And we would have here, as FEE continues to do, to have summer seminars for students. And we were very open to having foreign students who could afford to pay their own way. We didn't really have money to subsidize a scholarship. But if a student could more or less afford to pay his own way, to accept foreign students, given, space available. And that included students from former Soviet republics, Russia itself, or Central Asian republics like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, Ukraine in Europe, for example. And these students, we would send them a letter of support. This student has applied. They're only going to be here for a week to 10 days or something. We will be housing them. We will be providing meals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's showing that it's a bona fide, legitimate trip for them to come here for a student seminar. And frequently, and with great frustration, certainly on their part and our part as well, the consul officials at the American embassy in these various countries would turn down the visa request. So those former Soviet Republic students, actually a majority of them every summer when I was here doing this, were not allowed to come, even though in principle we would have had the space, or we would have made the space to have them attend. Because they would just make one reason or another that, that this wasn't legitimate. So, And it would be very hard to say that a young person your age, who, you have a school record, you have a support letter from the organization inviting them, et cetera, is some type of, trade tower bomb threat. But they would just arbitrarily restrict it. So in ways, it is limited and continues to be limited.
You say this comes out of our fear of Russia?
It's this idea that they're our enemy, so we're going to limit how many of them we're going to let come to the United States for one reason or another. But again, you end up punishing ordinary citizens. And again, I'm not saying vigilance to see that some would-be terrorist doesn't get through. I mean, that's reasonable. But I'm talking about in the vast majority of cases of ordinary people, such as people your age. And that's just sort of this idea of, the potential enemy, so we have to sort of teach them a lesson. And that mentality, and to the extent that that is part of the reason they would be turned down, I would think would be unfortunate and counterproductive. I think it would be good for those students to come to a seminar at an organization like FEE and hear some of these ideas. I mean, it can't hurt, right? Yeah.
Should we be concerned about Russian cyber warfare, and is it a threat to us?
Yes. The fact is that the Russians and the Chinese are very active. I'm not a cyber expert, right? My wife has to sometimes show me how to do things on the computer. I mean, it's so embarrassing. But I only know what I read in the newspapers. Okay, it's clear that the Russian government and the Chinese government actively support research in technological ways to subvert the internet systems, both business and national security, in other countries. And the episode that they undertook, it must be now 4 years ago, I guess, in Little Estonia on the Baltic Sea, where they basically brought down the entire internet system of the country for about 48 or 72 hours because of a political dispute that the Russian government had with the Estonian government. And this was sort of like to teach them a lesson to see what we can do. You're so now dependent upon the internet, we can shut your society down without sending one soldier across the border. You see what I'm saying? That in that sense, we should be concerned about it. And it is a problem. There are malicious governments who would try to play those tricks. But again, that has little to do with the idea of the ordinary citizen wanting to communicate, travel, interact.
We're going to break now for the LD students that want to go in the other room. We'll have an LD session. Worth mentioning that most of those cyber terrorists would rather work for Microsoft at high pay than work for the government in Russia.
Mr. Remke is completely right. If they could get to the United States, they'd much rather live and work in Silicon Valley. If nothing else, the weather is better than Siberia.
Okay, for LD students in the other room, now we're going to have questions here through the rest of this session. And, okay, great. Okay,
there are some other hands. Yes. I'll try to go back and forth here a little bit. Yes.
What do you think the biggest threat that Russia is to the United States right now? Is it nuclear problems or?
That's an interesting question. They obviously still have a very large nuclear arsenal carried over from the Soviet Union times of the Cold War. But those weapons are aging. They're not well maintained. And I just don't mean in working condition, security-wise. I mean, it's notorious that corruption is endemic in Russia, and often there is a concern that nuclear weapon components or even a nuclear weapon itself might be sold to terrorists out of the Russian arsenals of one type or another. But the fact is that as a military threat, in my opinion, the Russians are not a threat. They have not recovered from the disintegration of the Soviet military force when the Soviet Union collapsed. This is one of the things why Putin has wanted to have economic reform, to the extent that he has fostered it, because he wants the economy to get off the ground and start growing enough that there's sort of like economic fat, and out of the economic fat can come the tax resources to rebuild the Russian military, both nuclear arsenal, air force, and navy. most of the Russian Navy, particularly the submarines, are mothballed. They're old, still in significant disrepair, and not seaworthy. But the Russian military is strong enough to intimidate the little countries around the border of Russia, many of whom had formerly been part of the Soviet Union before it collapsed, like this little mini war with Georgia a couple of years ago. And that's the danger. Or their ability to use raw materials to sort of influence, and I use that in quote marks, relationships with other countries. Western Europe imports a large amount of natural gas and oil from Russia. And the Russians have sometimes attempted to play games with the free flow of the oil and gas under existing contracts to sort of twist the arm of Western European governments, sometimes subtly, sometimes not too subtly, to them, for them to sort of be for or against something when it involves some diplomatic issue between the U.S. and Russia. It's that type of, it's basically raw material manipulation and localized military intimidation that they have. But if they could restore their economy, and it was fat enough to be able to support the taxes and the resources to rebuild their military, that clearly is the vision, hope, and desire of someone like Vladimir Putin, who runs the country. He would like to see Russia, quote, great again, and to be feared and to be able to intimidate the world. Let me take one here. Yes?
Is Dmitry Medvedev better on his human rights stance and his general stance on economics than Putin is, or is Putin basically controlling Medvedev?
Medvedev is like this. Okay? He's the puppet, and Putin has the strings. Putin picked him. Okay, why is Medvedev the president of Russia and Putin the prime minister? Because under the existing Russian constitution, like the United States, you can only run for office twice in sequence and hold 2 4-year terms. Okay? So now Putin had to, under the constitution, leave the presidency. He couldn't run for a 3rd term. So he picked his replacement, who'd be malleable and would just basically be a front man for him. And they've been modifying the Russian constitution that now the presidential term would not be 4 years, but 6. And it is presumed that when the next presidential election comes up in Russia, which would be 2 years, I guess, Putin will run for president again. He will have held office for 2 terms, been out 1 term, and now going to run for a 6-year term. And that Medvedev will just be gone or be given some other position. But the fact is that all major decisions, all policy directions are made by Putin. And Medvedev was just a front-man puppet because of these constitutional issues. And he talks more free, more open, more democratic, more anti-corruption, but he has no power. He's just a voice, you know, for the ventriloquist. Yes.
Except for immigration, what policy would you most strongly support for U.S. in Russia?
Free trade. Just as it is useful for people to have a chance to interact and have opportunities, both for themselves and interacting with others, free trade. I think that the more that Russians could have a chance to buy American goods, have access to American goods, the more they would have motives and incentives to want to have their government stop the restrictions, the regulations and controls that limit their opportunities to have these things. Now let me be clear about this. I traveled in the old Soviet Union, as I said, and I was in the new Russia. The old Soviet Union was a disaster. It is not an exaggeration to say that there were, in the last years of the Soviet Union, there was no food in the stores. You would go to food stores, and the shelves were empty. There were no goods in the shops. For example, opposite the Kremlin in Moscow is a 3-story L-shaped building called GUM, G-U-M. And it was meant to be a Soviet-type shopping mall, okay? But it was just government shops. And poor quality goods, limited goods. Mismatch of, the qualities that people wanted. It was junk. But this was their idea of a shopping mall. And I remember I was there in one time in 1991, and I'm looking out, the shops are empty, there's very few customers. There's one long line. Women, just women, in a long line in one store. So of course I go there, what is this? I mean, the only store with a long line needs women. Women's underwear. Okay? That was the longest line for one store. But the problem was, comrade, women's underwear, one size fits all. Use safety pin to adjust. Okay, one size fits all. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. I'm making it sound, but that's what it was. Now, it is different today. That same shopping mall complex, GUM, is now totally transformed. Every conceivable store, boutique, international clothing chain is there. So, in a sense, Russia has everything. But only a very narrow segment of the population still has enough money to really afford it. If you go into the center of Moscow, there's all the modern hotels. There's the stores, the boutiques, the shops, fashionable things. A lot of casinos, right? Nightclubs and casinos. That's for the new wealthy Russians, most of whom are either comfortable or wealthy because of their connections with the government. I love Putin. Please be my partner, Mr. Putin. Okay, that type of thing. Or they're just corrupt gangsters. And that degree of mafia-type activities is still pervasive in Russia. If you get outside of the center, where they have sort of like this sort of shopping, casino, hotel, Disneyland environment, and to the rest of the city, it's old, dilapidated apartment buildings with poor facilities. People often have to work 2 or even 3 jobs to make ends meet for their families. So there's like this mirage or illusion of, oh, Moscow is like Paris or New York. But it's only for a very narrow and select group of the population who know how to be corrupt or have connections with the government. Where Moscow is a population of about 9 million people. And out of the 9 million people, probably 7 or 8 million live very hard and difficult and 2 or 3 job lives in bad, shoddy apartments. And in that sense, I think that to the extent that the ordinary Russian can have an opportunity to have more access to American goods that might be available at lower prices than what the Russian government now lets in and tries to restrict. And that they had more contact with Americans, that Americans could somehow more easily travel for business purposes, bringing goods in themselves. That would, in the long run, not overnight, but in the long run would do more good than most of the, diplomatic press releases that come out of Washington, D.C. I want to get the students first. Okay, yes.
Me?
Yes.
Are there supporters of Putin in the U.S.?
That is a very good question. And the answer would be yes, I've met a few. They're mostly Russians who, for one reason or another, are living in the United States, probably representing Russian businesses. Of course, Russian businesses that are in America successfully because of their connection with Putin's government in Moscow. That way they... So, you don't bite hand that feeds you, right? Okay. So, also, I should say, in fairness, actually Putin is very popular in Russia. And he's popular because he plays a very strong nationalist card. Oh, since the end of the Soviet Union, the West, including America, doesn't respect Russia. They view us as this third-rate power that's not the superpower of the Cold War era. They don't treat us as an equal. Why, we're a great people. We're a great nation. I'm going to make Russia great again. Yay, yay, yay. I mean, so he has that kind of sort of hyper-emotional nationalist support from a lot of people. And in fact, he plays that sort of be proud to be a Russian card to try to hide the fact and make people not focus on the fact that in everyday life, life is very hard and difficult. And again, once you get out of like the center of a couple of cities, for many people, life has not changed that much in comparison to the old Soviet times in terms of daily life, standards of living. But yeah, there are a few. But they have ulterior motives. Yes?
In light of the current state of individual freedom in Russia, is it the United States' job to try to improve human rights over there? So do we have a responsibility to try to restore the human rights?
Well, you know, I think, well, you see, further human rights. We're obviously not going to invade Russia to eliminate these government abuses. I think that, as I said, trade restrictions or trade barriers or sanctions often are counterproductive and harmful, both to ourselves and many of the people who supposedly we care about. I believe that the extent that I think that we can be better voices for human rights in Russia by respecting and practicing human rights ourselves, a sort of a beacon of an example, and to be practicing that when Russians want to come to America, and, you know, other than, as I was talking about, you know, if someone's, you know, found out to be, you know, a terrorist that wants to blow up, you know, this building or something. Other than that, just to be open and practice what we preach. Okay? People pick up on hypocrisy really quickly. So I believe that if we're sort of that famous beacon on a hill, and we practice our principles, including being open to those who live under oppression, that can do more to inspire others than many things. And let me say this, let me add, if I may, one other thing here, is that in the 19th century, America did not have an activist foreign policy. We didn't send troops to other countries. We didn't fight foreign wars. We basically viewed ourselves as settling this large continent, minding our own business, separated from the rest of the world since we didn't have airplanes or missiles then by these two great oceans. And what we do, and America served as an example of a free and open society, individual opportunity, enterprise, civil freedoms. And in fact, that served as an example and an inspiration for peoples in other countries to fight for their own freedom, and sometimes to cause revolutions in their own country to overthrow their own local dictator. And in the long run, that's probably a better and more successful model for us to follow from our own practice in the past. Let me go over here and then I'll come back. Yes?
You talked about how we should have like free immigration from Russia to the U.S. and also that we should have free trade with Russia. So, which side would you take on the issue of the Jackson-Vanik sanctions and all?
Okay. Originally, the Jackson-Vanik law or rules, if I understand what you're asking, was the fact that under the old Soviet Union, there were many Soviet Jews who wanted to leave the Soviet Union that the Soviet government would not allow to leave. They wanted to come either to the United States or Israel. Senator Jackson argued that the United States had to impose certain restrictions or sanctions on the Soviet Union until they respected the right of people who felt they were being politically or religiously persecuted to leave the Soviet Union if they wanted to. The thing is that, in fairness, that type of religious persecution no longer exists. Under the Soviet Union, there was state-sponsored anti-Semitism. For example, if you were Jewish, it was against the law, and you were subject to imprisonment and sent to a labor camp in Siberia if you attempted to teach Hebrew. Okay, just as many Christian denominations were prohibited from holding non-government approved religious services and study of of the New Testament. But that doesn't, in fairness, Putin is a lot of things. And besides what I've talked about, I'd be willing to talk hours more about all the things that he's evil at being. But there's one thing that, just to be fair to the facts, that you can't accuse Putin of being. And that is, I've read nor seen no indication that he is anti-Semitic. And even to the extent in which he has come down hard against Muslims, it has more to do with the fact that in the southern region of Russia, in this little republic called Chechnya, the Chechens have attempted to gain freedom from Russia. They want to be an independent country. And many of them are extremely devout and sometimes fanatical Muslims. And he's come down on the Muslims for that. But I have no indication, for all of his political authoritarianism, that he is motivated by anti-Semitism in any way. He will oppose any group, any political party, any movement, and any organized religious group that in any way seems to threaten the territorial integrity of Russia and the political stability in terms of his control of the country. Well, there is no anti-Semitism. There's no state-sponsored anti-Semitism. Any Russian citizen who happens to be Jewish who wants to leave and go to Israel is free to. There's virtually no restriction. In fact, some Russian Jews who went to Israel have gone back to Russia. I mean, Putin has a lot of things, like I said, but you can't accuse him of that. So to the extent that had to do with Soviet persecution of Jews, that doesn't exist in Russia anymore. There was a hand here. Okay, listen, I told you, my mother's family are Russian Jews. My wife's family are Russian Jews. So I know from her family experience, since her family lived there, the nature of what Soviet government-sponsored anti-Semitism was. I've heard enough and I saw enough. But I also know what goes on today from people I know over there and from reading things. And like I said, Putin can be accused of a lot of things, and many of which I've emphasized, and I hope I've made clear. But he's not doing this for anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish reasons. If you oppose the regime for either a political or organized religious reason, like the more fanatical fundamentalist Muslims, and in the case of Chechnya, because they want Chechnya to be a separate country out of Russia, then he'll come down like a ton of bricks with all the power of the secret police and the military. But he's not motivated by hatreds for religions or ethnic groups per se. I mean, I don't like the guy, but fair is fair. You judge him for what he really is. Yes.
Is there still a secret police in Russia?
Yes, very good question too. It's called. They changed his name from the KGB to the Federal Security Bureau, FSB. But they use the same building as their headquarters. Those who were there, let's say, 20 years ago, when there was still the Soviet Union with the KGB, if they haven't gotten so old to retire, many of the same people are still secret policemen. They still surveillance. They still follow. They still read your mail. And in my opinion, some of them are the ones who either do it themselves or hire these assassins to kill, like I said, reporters who report things that the government doesn't want. So yes, there is a secret police. Now again, it's not like in the really bad days of the Soviet Union where there's the image like the secret police show up in the middle of the night, knock on your door, and you disappear. You can be arrested, and they can make up phony baloney charges to find you an excuse to lock you away for a long time. And you don't want to be in a Russian prison, okay? It's not a Holiday Inn or a Hilton hotel, okay? But that type of arbitrary and mass arrests, like under the worst times of of the Soviet dictator of Stalin in the 1930s and 40s and early 1950s, it's not like that anymore. But there's a secret police. They read, they watch, they follow, and they will arrest and may find phony reasons to imprison you. And they have been known to either kill you or torture you when it has served their purposes. So yes, a version of the secret police is alive and well in Russia. Yes?
What does KGB stand for?
Oh, gosh. That is a long Russian name, which basically meant the security and surveillance something. I'm actually forgetting. It's too long ago, but it's just it's the initials of the Russian of state security, state secret security. They used to be called the Cheka. That was their first name, which itself was Cheka. Those were the initials for another long Russian security of terrorism, counter-revolution, and blah blah blah. Then the Cheka became the OUPU, OUGPU, and then it became the NKVD, and then it became the KGB, and now it's the Federal's security forces. A different hand. I don't mind answering another question, but I just want to let somebody have a chance who maybe hasn't asked a question. Or even a big person. Did you have a question?
I was going to ask about George Soros. He's been, American investor, he's been in the news lately about some of these doing bad things in this country. And as an example of that, his activities in the Ukraine were brought up.
All right.
And I'm just curious, what's your take on what George Soros did in the former Soviet bloc, and wasn't that a good thing?
Yes, George Soros, as some of you may know, is an extremely wealthy financier who made his living, and by which I mean hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, in commodity exchanges and currency exchanges on the foreign exchange markets. He himself is a Hungarian Jew who survived the Nazi concentration camps. His parents were killed by the Nazis, as were most of his family. He fortunately survived the war, and literally is a rags to riches story. He started as poor, uneducated, left as an orphan, and he got an education, he got into business, he became an extremely successful commodities and currency speculator and dealer, and he made his multi-billion-dollar fortune. What he did do in the last years of the Soviet Union and then after is he very charitably gave millions of dollars to set up a network of organizations in former Soviet republics or Eastern European countries called the Open Society. And he'd give seed money and money for several years. So these organizations in Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, could have little think tanks to espouse, defend, and spread the ideas of civil liberties and democratic government. There are many policies that Soros supports that, as an economist and as an advocate of a free market society, I don't agree with. But again, to give him his due, I knew people back in the 90s who were affiliated with these open society centers in these former Soviet republics. He did not attempt to intervene, manipulate behind the scenes. He looked for people who sincerely and honestly were for creating democratic forms of governments in those societies, who wanted to see that there were legal and constitutional guarantees for civil liberties, and to educate these people who had lived in communist countries as to why these things were good, and just basically gave the money to run with it. So in general, that aspects of his activities were quite meritorious and not really open to much criticism. But he has supported other things on international policy, domestic policy, roles of government in society in places like the United States, that as an economist and as someone who believes in a limited government environment, I find questionable and dubious. But that's one activity that in the early 90s really is not deserving of much criticism. Other questions from a new person, and then maybe another question from someone who's already asked a question? So now you understand to know everything. Gee, I'm really depressed. I mean impressed. Okay. Did you have another question? Okay.
I heard that many of the Russian citizens wish that the communist government would be reinstated. You know, they even sell postcards with Stalin on them. Do you know why?
Yeah, it has to do with, like, when I was answering this, I think it was your question, or someone's question about, you know, are there any Russians who support Putin? There are a lot of Russians who have this sense of national humiliation. Okay, it's very hard for a German to have, you know, wistful, you know, memories and nostalgia for the Hitler era. Hitler brought destruction to their country, occupation of their country, and the facts were laid before them about the mass and cruel murders that the Hitler regime did to people all over Europe. And so, you know, no German, except obviously some nut fringe, you know, would say, oh, if only we could have the Nazi period back. I mean, no normal German does that. I mean, they've accepted the fact that they or their parents or their grandparents, you know, were part of a monster regime that caused a war, and you know, the whirlwind came back on them and destroyed them. The difference with the Russians is they don't feel defeated. Okay, they don't feel defeated. They lost the Cold War, but the Soviet Union was not invaded. It was not occupied. It had not been destroyed in a war. What they feel is that they had this great nation that the world respected because of its military power and intimidating influence. And now the country disintegrated. It broke up into 15 separate countries, with Russia being the largest of the now separate countries from the Soviet Union. Okay? That they're poor now, that no one respects them, that they're not taken seriously, these personal frustrations and this sense of national frustration as being part of a society, a culture, has created this backlash of nostalgia for when Russia was great. Russia was powerful. Russia was respected. Russia was the victor in the war, you know, the Second World War. And that results in a lot of Russians supporting Putin, as I was saying, in taxi cabs in Moscow. Sometimes, I'm not saying in everyone, but sometimes you'll see, instead of the little puppy dog with the shaking head, you'll find a picture of Stalin. Now, Stalin was a mass murderer. He probably shot his own wife because she got into an argument with him in a Kremlin dinner in 1934. That's uncertain, but it's possible he actually shot her. The usual interpretation is that she committed suicide, but if she did, it was a strange suicide. But anyway, he either shot her and he drove her to suicide, okay? Which is like a second bad thing. Okay. He literally caused the deaths of probably 30 to 40 million people. Okay? Killing and working to death the citizens of the Soviet Union. When he decided to force the end of private farming in the Soviet Union in the early 1930s, the collectivization of the lands, it was called, the Russian peasants didn't want to give up their land. This is my farm, this is my cow, this is my little home. And to break their will, he sent the secret police and the army into all of these agricultural areas of southern European Russia and the Ukraine, surrounded them, and took away all the food. And he drove them into the collective farms through starvation. And it is estimated that 9 to 12 million people died of starvation in this government-caused famine to force the peasants to give up their private farms and to go live and work on these created government collective farms. He was a monster. He started World War II. He cut a deal with Hitler to go to war and divide Poland among the two of them, to divide up Eastern Europe. And the only reason he became our ally is because Hitler broke his promise and invaded the Soviet Union. But the Soviet archives show today that if Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin was building up his military forces to stab Hitler in the back in 1942. So what was Stalin upset about? Hitler beat him to the punch of what he was going to do to Hitler. I mean, we're talking about a monster here. Okay? He would sit in his office and sign the death certificates of thousands of people at a time. Thousands of people at a time. Some of whom were people he knew. And then he would retire to his private movie theater in the Kremlin and watch comedies and American Westerns. He loved John Wayne Westerns. Okay. But because of this sort of sense of national humiliation, lack of national respect, he's become sort of, for a certain segment of Russian society, sort of this icon of when Russia was strong, the victor in World War II, the power who made sure that things were in order. And that's part of this perverse reaction to the sense that, well, we weren't defeated, and yet we lost the Cold War. Why? Let me make an analogy. This is very similar to the thinking of many Germans after the First World War. Because World War I ended on November 11th, 1918. But no part of Germany was occupied by the Allied powers, the French, the British, or the Americans. A ceasefire, an armistice was signed, while German forces were still in place in part of northern France and Belgium. And the propaganda that the Germans had been fed during the war, up until virtually the end, is that the Germans were strong and that it was political manipulations in the back, a stab in the back. In fact, German Jews stabbed us in the back, that resulted in Germany having to accept defeat when it hadn't been defeated. And that created the same sense of humiliation and national frustration in the 1920s that someone like Hitler played upon. Oh, we weren't defeated. We were forced into losing territory. They made us take away our military. They don't treat us as an equal nation in the world. You know, these dark forces, foreign powers and Jews, destroyed Germany. And that's the same type of sense of national frustration that a Hitler could play upon with the Germans in the 1920s, leading to him coming to power in 1933, that I'm not saying it's exactly a carbon copy, but it's sort of like a similarity to what Putin plays with the Russians. We weren't defeated in the Cold War. We lost to all these other republics that have been part of the Soviet Union. They don't treat us as an equal. We should be powerful again. Follow me. See, it's the same type of mentality. Yes?
The people who, I must, maybe you can, the people who are Russian now, after all this going through, are the people who are left in Russia, are they the only people who survived and they're stronger, or are they just the people who didn't leave and are weaker? Because I know a lot of Russians who come to America are the fight till the end kind of Russians. So I just wondered how the leaving and the destruction of so many people, what did the people that were left in Russia, what is their strength?
That actually is also a very good question. That is a very good question. The 75 years of communism destroyed all those who had an individualistic will. A potential businessman, a potential free thinker, someone who could have been an entrepreneur. They were either broken in their spirit or they were killed. Who was left? The weak, the obedient, the passive, and the resigned, often with alcohol. For example, my wife earned her PhD in history and political science at Moscow State University. For the first 2 years of her time at the university, every autumn was not going to her classes, but being sent to a collective farm with other students to pick potatoes or other vegetables at harvest time. Why? Because the collective farm workers were all drunk. Well, who's going to pick the harvest other than the soldiers, right? The soldiers could be ordered in, the young conscripts. And in fact, if you did not, quote, volunteer to go pick the potatoes and the other food you would be expelled, and that ends your university career as a student. And so, in fact, yes. Now, the other thing is that there were the bright, the intelligent, the achievers. They tended to go into the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, mathematics. Why? Because these were fields that the regime needed. It didn't have ideological content. You didn't have to lie. You didn't have to twist the truth. You didn't have to make up history. You need the physicists, the chemists, the engineers, the mathematicians to do what? To build industry and to build a nuclear a missile force. Okay? So the best and the brightest went into the areas where the government intellectually left them alone the most, where they could develop their skills independently because the government needed their abilities for their own purposes. Okay? Now they are the ones who have left the Soviet Union. The best and the brightest among the scientists and the mathematicians, they're teaching at Princeton, they're teaching at Harvard, they're teaching at the University of London or in Paris or in Berlin or someplace. Okay? Or they had the mind of the mathematician, the strategist, the physicist to go into crime. When the Soviet Union collapsed, who became the leading criminal kingpins? Like the mafia bosses, right? The mafia bosses. 9 times out of 10, they were people who had been professional physicists, mathematicians, or chemists, or engineers. Because they applied their intellectual ability, their creative mental ability, right? Science requires independence and creative thought. To how do I make a fortune by playing the system in the underworld of crime? So it debilitated the population significantly. One of the frustrations that people studying in Russia have today is that those whom they study with at the university are no longer world-class scientists and mathematicians, but at the most second and third rate, because the others who were able to get out are gone. That's a good question too, actually. Yes?
What's the current state of the Russian black market? Do we still have one?
Yes. But it's slightly different. You see, in the old Soviet Union, the black market was for everything. Everything from blue jeans to food to gasoline for your car to umbrellas. I mean, everything. Including to getting a ticket to go see the Bolshoi Theater in Moscow. Because you couldn't just, tickets were given out based upon political motivations most of the time. So you had to have a friend who knew a friend who had a cousin who knew someone who worked in the ticket office at the Bolshoi, and now you get a ticket. Okay? Or you went to the black market to have to buy pharmaceuticals. Right? It's national health care in Russia. Okay, it's free for everyone, which means it's not available, and if you get in, you have to bribe people. I'm going to be direct here, okay? Don't want to offend anybody. I'm going to speak directly here. I know there are younger people here, and I apologize, but people should know this, okay? You've had an operation in a government-run hospital. You need to go to the bathroom. You can't get up, right? It's hard to get up after an operation. You better have money to bribe an orderly to bring a bedpan. After you've done your business in the bedpan, you better have money to bribe the orderly to take away the bedpan. You need antibiotics. Medicine is free, but under the plan, not enough antibiotics have been produced for everyone, the government plan of production. It is available in the special hospitals and clinics reserved for the party officials and the upper echelon bureaucrats. But for the average Soviet citizen, the workers, forget it. You better know who to contact on a black market to get the antibiotic that's going to save your child. You could have, and there were various operations that would be performed in which you would have to do it without anesthetic. Okay, you would have operations without anesthetics. That pervasiveness of corruption, because the government produces everything and distributes everything, and produces what it thinks is important and valuable, not what people in every day would want produced. As in the market economy, people want things, businessmen see the profits to give the people what they want, and that's why the stores are filled with everything that we desire. Under central planning, the government would decide what the government wants. And so they got plenty of what they wanted, even if that meant very little of the things that the ordinary person would have desired to be produced. That type of pervasive black market in everything, just for everyday life, is no longer the case. But a black market goes on in other things. You want a college, you want a university degree? You have your father pay for your degree. You never go to class. You never take a test. But now you have your bachelor's degree or even a PhD in science. Sometimes that even applies to medical school. You want to be operated on by that doctor? Okay, down to the mundane level, you want to drive a car. But who wants to go to driver's school or have to take a driving test? You bribe some bureaucrat in the driving license bureau, and you get your driver's license even though you've never been behind the wheel before. You want to be in traffic with that guy? Okay, that's the type of thing that constantly goes on. That type of corruption and black market activity. You want to go into business? Your business exists and it's starting growing, so it's large enough to be noticed. You better be able to bribe mafia officials to make them your secret partners so other mafia organizations don't show up to try to extort you. So you pick the mafia organization as your silent partner who'll protect you from the others. And you better be able to bribe government members in the ministries that regulate your industry, determine your taxes, or determine whether you can import or export things without which your business cannot be profitable. That's the type of corrupt black market activity that goes on. Yes?
Obviously, we have different histories, and our country has been brought together through immigration. People have seen an opportunity to, through self-reliance, through that they can better themselves. They're coming from situations that probably were horrible.
Yes.
They have great hope in the ideals of this country, and the government is based on that to a point. And but the government gets much of its encouragement because there is such a glorious ideal holding this country together, and they don't have to feel threatened in a lot of ways. And when the Cold War, dissolved, we found out that there was no evenness in the race between Russia and the United States. We were overwhelmingly powerful.
Right.
We don't feel threatened, but there is a different history in Russia. They've come through being serfs, where they were tied to the land, where they were slaves, literally. The aristocracy there believed that they were backward, and they truly were, to the rest of Europe.
Right.
They felt that they were secondary. They've always felt that they were always behind. All this came out through the communist revolution. This is why they were right through all this. There is a national psyche, I would wonder, I've heard of this, where they are prone, in general, to be able to feel like they cannot make it unless they have strong security. They're not going to feel comfortable unless they can be in control and through fear. That is, if this is a large national security, a psyche that they can't overcome because of their strong history of where they're coming back from. Their massive country, many ethnic groups. The Mongols overcame the basic Russian, early on. They've always felt, we've never been through this though, they've always felt like they are fighting for their security.
Right. I'm tempted to say you're right, but I'm also tempted to say only within certain limits. It is true that the Russians, there is a meaning of history, culture, tradition, and custom that influences people because of the way they're brought up, the stories they hear, the history they learn, the attitudes that they absorb and adapt from parents, relatives, family, neighbors. And so there is a sense of a national psyche or culture that can't be discounted completely. And I know that if my wife was here and you had asked her that question, obviously being a Russian from Russia and having lived the bulk of her life there until we were married in '91, she would agree with you up to a point, because there's a lot of things about Russian society and the Russian mentality that frustrates her along the lines that you have been suggesting. But I think that what she would say, and my observations and my study says, is that while all of that is true, we should not downplay that which is common among all people everywhere. A desire for self-improvement, a desire for a degree of independence and freedom, not to be controlled and manipulated by another. That in fact we should not forget the universal qualities of human beings, as well as the historical unique properties of specific peoples in their cultures. And that makes me say that it is not impossible, it does not have to take forever for Russians or any other people to escape from their pasts. For example, during the time of the Tsars, before the First World War, there would be visitors to old imperial Russia, Americans, Frenchmen, Englishmen, who'd spend time there, either as just travelers or as diplomats, and they'd return to their home country and then write accounts of their impressions and memoirs of life in Russia in the 1830s and the 1840s. And they would often say those things. The Russians are passive. They're waiting for the good Tsar to give them, manna from heaven. They're always looking for excuses. They avoid responsibility. They're afraid of insecurity. At the same time, however, when those brief times when Russians have been given freedom and a degree, and I emphasize a degree of an institutional order, in which they're expected to act in ways similar to what we take for granted as action in the West in the marketplace. You're a businessman. You can't cheat. You can't steal. You can't kill. Okay? You're expected to make a product that consumers want and offer it at a price that they're willing to pay better than the guy down the street who also wants to get the customer's business. Okay? Those general, standard market rules of the game. When they've been put into that situation, Russians act just like us. For example, World War I and the civil war that followed the Russian Revolution devastated Russia. The war and the civil war resulted in the death of at least 10 million people, actually 15 million if you count the war deaths, and lowered Russian industrial output and standards of living by about 50% from what it had been in 1914. Lenin had first attempted to have a leap into full communism, what he called war communism. No private property, no private agriculture, no wages, no money, just central planning. It was a total disaster and the peasants were revolting. So in 1922, realizing that the peasants and even workers were going to revolt against his regime and bring his regime down, he said, two steps backward and then a step forward. And he introduced what he called the new economic policy. You know, we didn't really mean to jump fully into communism. You know, too quick. It was just an emergency during the Civil War. And he reinstituted private farming. He reprivatized small and medium-sized businesses. And he allowed a degree of small commercial banking. What was left in the government's hands were what he called the commanding heights: heavy industry, import-export trade, and large banking, commerce, and money, okay, currency control. But all agriculture and small and medium-sized business was pretty much left to an open competitive environment, okay? Though the government was still the monopoly political controller, sort of like China today, right? Degrees of free markets, but it's the monopoly government Communist Party. Between 1922 and 1928, before Stalin then attempted to re-collectivize and renationalize everything, in that period, 1922 to 1928, this period of limited window of small and medium-sized reintroduced free enterprise brought Russia's standard of living and industrial production back to what it was before the First World War in just a 5 or 6 year period. Why? Because that shows that Russians, too, could be as hardworking, industrious, independent, entrepreneurial, and business-oriented as anybody else, including the hard, individualistic peasant farmers in the country. It's my land, I grow my crop, I sell it, I make my money. So we should not forget what is universal in the human character when we're also appreciating what is historically unique because of the accidents of birth culturally for each of us.
We're just about out of time here.
Okay.
Yeah, the marketplace is what helps improve these characteristics from world. Yeah.
Yes. Put people in the similar institutions of having to play by those rules of the market game, voluntary exchange, profit motive, but no murder, stealing, or fraud. The desirable qualities in people's behavior tends to start rising to the surface. Put them in bad traditions, customs, and institutions, and you can bring out the worst. So in other words, the rules of the game matter. Okay, thank you very much.